My wife, Pat, she made a statement when she was real sick at the end of last year, and she was home. You could put me right in a nursing home where they'll do all this. I said, honey, do death do we part. I meant every word of it. And she started crying.
In the high-octane world of drag racing, one name stands as an absolute titan: Big Daddy Don Garlits. For over 7 decades, he didn't just drive fast. He cheated death, revolutionized safety after losing half his foot in a catastrophic explosion, and built an empire out of pure grit and horsepower. But as the roar of the engines fades at age 94, the legendary father of drag racing sits in the quiet halls of his Florida museum, surrounded by polished chrome and ancient trophies, facing a heartbreaking reality that speed can never outrun. Stripped of the love of his life, betrayed by those he trusted, and wrestling with the physical toll of a lifetime on the edge, Garlits faces his most painful challenge yet: the crushing silence of being a living legend left behind by time. The story of drag racing cannot be told without the soil of Ocala, Florida, and the fierce drive of a boy born during the harsh years of the Great Depression. Don Garlits was not raised in luxury. He grew up in a world where everything had to be earned with calloused hands and greasy knuckles. From a very young age, Don possessed a restless mind. He didn't just look at automobiles as simple machines to get from one place to another. To young Don, an engine was a living, breathing creature, a mystery waiting to be solved. He spent endless hours in small, dimly lit garages, taking apart old parts, polishing metal, and learning how to squeeze every single drop of horsepower out of abandoned engines. Yet, behind his fierce, burning obsession to be the fastest man on 4 wheels was something far deeper than just a desire for trophies. Don wanted to build something real. He wanted to prove that a kid from rural Florida, working with scrap metal and home-built tools, could stand up to the wealthy racing teams of the West Coast and beat them at their own game. During these early, turbulent years of high speed and constant danger, one person stood firmly by his side: his high school sweetheart, Patricia. Patricia was not just Don's wife. She was his steady anchor in a sea of wild ambition. When money was tight and the future was uncertain, Patricia was there. She helped weld parts, managed the minimal family budget, and washed the black grease from his work shirts. While Don chased the intoxicating thrill of speed, Patricia provided the quiet love and emotional foundation he needed to keep going. Together, they formed an unbreakable partnership. But the path Don chose was paved with severe hazards. In the early days of drag racing, safety was almost an afterthought. Drivers sat directly behind giant, supercharged engines, holding on to steering wheels while facing lethal power and volatile fuels. Don was pushing his home-built dragsters beyond known human limits, completely unaware that the dangerous game he was playing would soon exact a heavy physical price. As Don lined up his dragster on a fateful afternoon in 1970, ready to prove his dominance once again, a split-second mechanical catastrophe tore through the air. A blinding flash of fire and metal that would sever his body, shock the entire motorsport world, and force him to make a choice that changed racing history forever. On March 8, 1970, at the Lions drag strip in California, time seemed to stand still. Don Garlits staged his iconic front-engine dragster at the starting line. The crowd cheered, the engine roared like thunder, and the Christmas tree lights flashed green. Don slammed down the throttle. But in less than a fraction of a second, absolute horror struck. The car's heavy 2-speed transmission exploded into sharp metal shrapnel. The violent blast tore through the floorboard, cutting the race car cleanly in half and instantly severing part of Don's right foot. Fire and thick smoke filled the air as the wrecked machine slid down the asphalt. Emergency crews rushed to the scene to pull the bloody legendary driver from the smoking wreckage. Don was rushed to the hospital, his body battered, his foot mangled, and his career seemingly over in a single heart-stopping moment. Doctors worked tirelessly to save his life and leg, but the physical pain was overwhelming. For many men, such a horrific injury would have marked the end of the road. The psychological trauma alone would have kept most drivers far away from a race car for the rest of their lives. Sitting in his sterile hospital bed, surrounded by white walls and bandages, Don wrestled with deep emotional darkness. The sport he loved had almost claimed his life and left him permanently maimed. Yet, even in his darkest hour, Don's brilliant engineering mind refused to shut down. He realized that sitting behind a massive, explosive engine was a death trap for every driver on the track. If he wanted to keep racing and keep other drivers alive, the entire design of the dragster had to change. With Patricia sitting faithfully at his bedside, comforting him through severe pain, Don began sketching new ideas on scrap paper. He decided to do what the experts said was impossible: place the engine behind the driver. Critics laughed at the idea, calling it foolish and unsteerable. But Don's spirit was unyielding. He turned his agonizing recovery into a mission of pure reinvention, building the revolutionary rear-engine top-fuel dragster that would forever protect drivers from catastrophic front-end engine blasts. Don conquered the track, shattered world records, and silenced every single skeptic who doubted his revolutionary machine. But as the decades rolled on and he stood atop the racing world, a far more dangerous and subtle enemy was quietly preparing to strike him where it hurt the most. After decades of thrilling victories, bone-shattering crashes, and breaking speed records, the time eventually came for Don Garlits to step away from full-time, high-octane competition. But a man like Big Daddy could never simply sit still and grow old quietly. His deep passion for the sport ran far too deep in his veins. Don channeled his endless energy into a brand new dream: building a permanent home for the history of drag racing. In his hometown of Ocala, Florida, he opened the Don Garlits Museum of Drag Racing. This grand museum was not just a collection of old cars. It was a sacred temple of speed and sweat. Don and Patricia dedicated their lives to gathering, restoring, and preserving historic dragsters, classic automobiles, rare engines, and priceless memorabilia from every era of motorsport. Every polished chrome engine and every custom paint job told a story of human courage, mechanical brilliance, and relentless ambition. Together, Don and Patricia welcomed millions of eager fans from around the globe, sharing personal stories of victory and survival. To the outside world, Don Garlits was living a glorious retirement, standing proudly as the undisputed founding father of drag racing. But behind his warm, famous smile, the severe physical toll of his long, violent career was beginning to catch up with him. Years of absorbing brutal launch forces, enduring high-speed concussions, and suffering detached retinas had left lasting scars on his aging body. Chronic pain became his silent, daily companion. Even more troubling was the quiet reality that time was relentlessly moving forward. The fast-paced world that Don had helped create was beginning to change, and the close friends and fiercest rivals who had shared the track with him were slowly passing away, one by one. Don spent his days surrounded by silent, motionless race cars that once screamed at over 200 miles per hour. The museum was a beautiful place of triumph, but it was also beginning to feel like a quiet hallway filled with ghosts of the past. Through it all, Patricia remained his steady guiding light, holding his hand as they walked through the grand halls of their shared life's work. Just as Don thought he could spend his sunset years peacefully reflecting on his historic accomplishments alongside his beloved wife, a terrifying medical crisis struck their home, shattering his world into a million pieces. For nearly 61 years, Patricia Garlits was the steady beating heart behind the legendary Big Daddy. She was the quiet force that held their family together through every terrifying hospital stay, every risky financial gamble, and every long night in the garage. But in her later years, a cruel and relentless illness began to steal her away. Patricia was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and dementia. The woman who had been Don's strongest protector and closest confidant was slowly slipping into darkness. Faced with this heartbreaking reality, Don stepped into the most important role of his entire life. The man who had spent his youth conquering the world's scariest racetracks became a tender, patient, and devoted primary caregiver. Don put aside his tools and his projects to devote every waking moment to comforting Patricia. He sat beside her chair, held her fragile, trembling hands, fed her meals, and spoke gently to her, reminding her of the golden days they had shared together in their youth. Watching the love of his life suffer was a deep, emotional agony that no racetrack victory could ever erase. Don felt completely helpless against an enemy he could not outrun or out-engineer with his hands. In February 2014, the inevitable tragedy struck. Patricia passed away peacefully at the age of 79. The loss hit Don with the force of a high-speed collision. The massive family estate and the vast museum grounds, once filled with laughter, lively conversations, and shared dreams, suddenly became devastatingly quiet. The silence in the empty house was deafening. Don found himself walking alone through dark rooms, surrounded by framed photographs of their youth and trophies that no longer held the same shine. He realized the heavy, painful truth that all the fame, money, and glory in the world could never fill the empty chair at his dining table or bring back the woman who had made his life complete. Drowning in profound grief and trying to navigate life without his guiding star, Don was suddenly forced to face another cruel blow, a bitter betrayal from within his own inner circle that threatened to tear down his life's work. Grief is a heavy burden to carry, especially for an elderly man standing alone in a vast world. Following Patricia's passing, Don Garlits found himself deeply vulnerable, navigating an empty house and an overwhelming sense of loss. Unfortunately, as Don entered his 80s and 90s, the physical limitations of old age began to settle in. His vision weakened, his joints burned with chronic pain, and his daily physical mobility slowed down significantly. It was during this fragile period that troubling conflicts and internal disputes began to cloud the legend's life. When a famous figure grows older, the vast estate, valuable museum collection, and historic legacy they leave behind often attract unwanted greed and opportunistic mindsets. Don began to face painful legal disputes, family rifts, and trusted business relationships that suddenly turned cold and sour. People who Don believed had his best interests at heart began clashing over the management and future control of the Don Garlits Museum of Drag Racing. For a proud, self-made man who had built his empire from nothing through pure sweat and honesty, this internal conflict was a soul-crushing blow. Don felt as though vultures were circling the very sanctuary he and Patricia had built together with their own bare hands. The emotional pain of betrayal was far sharper than any physical injury Don had ever sustained in a race car crash. The fierce champion who once commanded thousands of cheering fans and sold-out grandstands now felt intensely isolated, fighting quiet, exhausting battles behind closed doors just to protect his name and legacy. He realized that the world outside the racetrack could be far colder and more treacherous than the dangerous sport he had dedicated his entire life to conquering. With his heart heavy from betrayal, his body exhausted by age, and his soul aching for his lost wife, Don stood at a crossroads, wondering if he had any fight left in him, or if the time had come to finally surrender to the dark quietness around him. Now, at 94 years old, the world around Big Daddy Don Garlits has slowed down to a quiet crawl. The thunderous roar of 8,000 horsepower engines that once defined his everyday existence has been replaced by the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in his Florida home. Daily life is now a humble, measured struggle against the relentless process of growing old. His once sharp vision is clouded, his legs are stiff from decades of brutal physical trauma, and every step requires careful effort. Yet, despite his frailty, Don still makes his way into the museum nearly every single day. Visitors who walk through the doors are often stunned to see the living legend himself, wearing his signature drag racing cap, leaning against the polished bodies of his legendary Swamp Rat race cars. To the fans, he is an untouchable hero, a tough survivor who cheated death and changed the world of motorsports forever. They ask for autographs, snap pictures, and thank him for the thrilling memories he gave them. Don smiles politely and thanks them, but behind his warm blue eyes lies a deep, quiet sadness that few people truly understand. When the crowds go home and the museum lights go dim, Don walks through the quiet aisles alone. He stops in front of Swamp Rat Eye, the crude, home-built car that started his incredible journey so many decades ago. In those silent moments, he isn't thinking about world records or racing glory. He is thinking about Patricia. He talks to her memory in the quiet hall, missing her gentle touch and reassuring voice. Don has outlived almost all of his original racing rivals, his closest mechanics, and the love of his life. He stands as a lonely titan in the twilight of his existence, reflecting deeply on the choices he made, the heavy sacrifices he demanded of his family, and the true cost of chasing greatness at all costs. As Don stood in the dim light of his museum, Staring at the dust motes dancing over the hood of his favorite race car, he offered a quiet, unexpected reflection about his legendary life, a truth that completely changes how we look at his sacrifice. When we look back at the incredible life of Big Daddy Don Garlits, we see a story that reaches far beyond the boundaries of motor racing. It is a deeply human story about the eternal trade-off between extraordinary achievement and personal peace. Don gave everything he had to the sport of drag racing. He sacrificed his physical body, endured severe, life-altering injuries, and faced constant danger, all in pursuit of a dream to be the absolute best. His engineering genius saved countless lives by moving the engine behind the driver, forever changing the safety standards of motorsports. His stubborn grit proved that a person with limited resources and unlimited determination can achieve world-defining greatness. But as the curtain falls on his final chapter at age 94, the true emotional weight of his journey becomes painfully clear. Greatness demands a heavy price, and Don Garlits paid every single penny. He sits today in the quiet sanctuary of his museum, surrounded by pristine chrome machines, shiny gold trophies, and historic records that will stand for all time. Yet, the trophies cannot talk back to him, and the cold metal of the race cars cannot keep him warm in the cool evening air. The true tragedy of his final years is not just the physical pain of growing old or the legal conflicts that threatened his peace. It is the crushing loneliness of outliving the world he built and the woman who gave it all meaning. As the Florida sun sets over the quiet museum grounds and the lights switch off one by one, the silent dragsters stand like giant guardians of a golden era that will never return. Don Garlits proved to the entire world that speed can conquer distance, time, and human limits. But in the quiet end, as the engines finally cool down and the applause fades into history, he leaves us with a lingering, powerful lesson that resonates deep in our hearts. When the final engine note dies away and the quiet darkness settles in, one ultimate question remains for every one of us to answer. In our own pursuit of greatness, what are we willing to trade away? And will it be worth the heavy price when we stand alone at the finish line?